let's talk about the what you call the Trinity of austerity, the three elements that, or I guess aspects of austerity, how they play out in our economics.
Yes, definitely. So you pointed to a very crucial point of the capital order, is to say that austerity is depicted as a necessity, as the only way forward, but it is actually the most political choice of all in order to build the false understanding that we live in the only way that is possible for humans to live, which is in a capitalist economy, right? So austerity as the protector of capitalism. And when we talk about capitalism, we mean the socioeconomic system we're under, by which the majority of us takes as a given and as a necessity to go work for a very low wage and in precarious conditions in order to make a living. So the fact that we depend on the market for our survival, the fact that to eat, to sleep, to go to school, to get medicine, we have to go and sell our labor power in return for a very low wage. Well, this is exactly what austerity is aiming to protect. This is the reason for the title of the book, The Capital Order. Capital, meaning the wealth that our society produces, presupposes capital as the social relation by which we all accept our condition as wage workers. And this is something that, again, austerity builds as a necessity. But what the book discovers is that if we look at what was happening 100 years ago, we see something that, again, incredibly is so obvious today, which is that in moment of social upheaval, in moment in which people are saying, no, we are sick of actually our conditions, of not being able to get to the end of a month and being so precarious in our livelihoods, in moments in which people want to participate in economic decisions to make a change, a radical one, well, it is in this moment that austerity is crucial in order to defeat any alternatives to the current status quo. So what is austerity? Austerity is fundamentally a trinity of policies that work together to silence working people. And what are these policies? Well, fiscal austerity is about cutting the social part of the budget. So cutting welfare measures. So cutting benefits, unemployment benefits, housing benefits, Medicare, Medicaid, so on and so forth.
That is when we hear politicians say shared sacrifice. I mean, and really what they're talking about is shared sacrifice, but really shared amongst 95% of us type of situation.
Yeah, because the idea is that we got to cut to pay back the debt. Well, guess what happens? When you cut, you're not cutting on the military, you're cutting on the social services, and you are also cutting in order to give money to the creditors of our society, which are the 1%, these international financial elites, by the way, not even necessarily, part of Americans themselves. So that's fiscal austerity in the forms of cuts in the social budget. Then we have fiscal austerity in the form of where does the state take money from? And the idea is that fiscal austerity is about taxing the poor more than taxing the rich. And a fancy word is regressive taxation. The fact that actually, while the state decides to cut the top income brackets, cut corporate taxes, at the same time, it's increasing consumption taxes, which is what hits us all in the same way. So it's important to recognize that during Eisenhower's time, the top income bracket was 91%. And right now, we are actually at a top income bracket that is less than 37% in 2021. So that actually, at the current moment, the richest 400 families in the United States pay a lower overall tax rate than any other income group. So it's quite astonishing the amount of regressive taxation that is structural to the American economy. And there's plenty of research on this.
And we should just, I love to do, to remind people of the statistic. every dollar over $470,000 during Eisenhower time would have been taxed 90 cents on that dollar. Over that amount, that would have been $3 million today. Every dollar over $3 million that you earned would be taxed about 90%. And, people can argue as to what the effective tax rate was. The effective tax rate was still even maybe 20% more than the highest stated tax rate today. So regardless, the level of taxation at that time was much greater, leading into what they call the great expansion or compression, I guess. But I'm sorry, continue.
And the idea there is, of course, that taxation in a progressive sense would have been about redistributing resources from the few to the many. What austerity is all about is exactly the opposite. It's about shifting resources or extracting resources from the majority of Americans or people everywhere else in the world to the very tiny minority who benefits, right? Even we know that the corporate taxes were cut by Trump from 35% to 21%. So even corporations basically pay very little tax. So this is fiscal austerity. Then we have monetary austerity. And monetary austerity is what, well, we've been seeing for the last 6 months at least, which is what? Huge increases, unprecedented increases in interest rates. So the fact that money is becoming dearer. What does this mean? Well, it means, A, that for the normal household, it's much more expensive to take on credit, because we know that Americans actually live on credit because wages are so low. So now it's more expensive to actually take on a mortgage or whatnot. Secondly, it means that these increases in interest rates are intentionally slowing down the economy because it's also more expensive to borrow in order to invest. So what we see right now is that the American economy is slowly slowing down, which means that unemployment is increasing. Layoffs are increasing. And this is not the outcome of bad theory that doesn't understand what it's doing. It's actually purposefully so that someone like Jerome Powell admits that in order to curtail inflation, we need to get rid of this tight labor market, meaning that we need to get rid of the fact that in the last year, actually workers have been doing pretty well in their bargaining power with their employees, because actually nominal wages have gone up and a lot of people have actually refused to go back to work, which means that there's much more labor demand than labor supply. So this was a very favorable moment for workers because, oh man, now I don't have the statistics with me here, but it's actually now I think there's actually 2 job openings for every unemployed person. And it used to be just 10 years ago that there were 4 people competing for 1 job. So actually remember, but this is actually pretty impressive to give you a sense of how tight and robust the labor market is.
And,
so what
we're seeing this in the context of labor actions around the country and whatnot. And we should also say, and I don't want to go off too much on a tangent here, but Powell is claiming that the implication is, and because he's been explicit, we need to weaken labor. I don't know exactly what his words have been, but I'm paraphrasing, but not by much. I mean, he has literally said we need to weaken the labor market, and we should note though that the inflation that we have seen has outpaced wage growth to this point, which means that this is not his solution is a solution to something that is not necessarily the problem that he claims. And I think there is like widespread understanding that on some level too, what we're seeing is inflation, not as a function of overheated demand per se, but mismatched demand and supply because we had we had COVID and it screwed up our supply lines and whatnot. But he's going in there and this is not even this is about weakening labor. Period. End of story for him, which is not really the problem that we supposedly have. And your part of your argument ultimately is that this is not an irrational response, it's only irrational if you assume that they're trying to fix something that the inflation, as opposed to they're trying to fix an imbalance that they see between labor and capital.
Absolutely. So here is really where we see how timely the historical reconstruction is. It's because as it was 100 years ago, experts today, such as Powell, are being very explicit about the purpose of austerity in the form, for example, of higher interest rates. The purpose is to discipline workers into going back to their low-paid jobs. And this they say very explicitly. They're saying the labor market is too robust. Someone like Larry Summers is telling us explicitly, in order for our economy to run smoothly again, we need a higher unemployment rate. We need to go even to 7% unemployment rate. Now it's too low. So clearly, when we see that inflation, and there's a lot of discussion about where inflation comes from, right? And many economists tell us that inflation is actually all due to markups on profits. So if you read someone like Robert Reich, someone like Rick Wolf, they're telling us actually inflation is due to the opposite problem. It's not too much purchasing power of the people, but it's actually too much political power in the hands of the few who actually decide on what prices to give to goods and commodities. So the thing here is that, as you pointed out very explicitly, is that there's a pretense that inflation is a technical problem that has to be resolved with the technical solution of increasing the interest rates. But really what is obvious is that inflation is an incredibly political problem. Why? Because inflation triggers discontent. People get upset. People realize that the system is not as efficient as it claims, that the market mechanism, the fact that our relations are mediated by money, which is unstable, might not be the best of possible world. Thus, the ideology of the best and only possible system is breaking down. In this moment, workers get more upset, of course, because their purchasing power goes down. Thus, we see how all the labor unrest in the United States at the moment, there's hundreds of strikes going on. There's this great labor tracker from Cornell University, Labor Action Tracker, that really shows real time how many workers are actually on the picket line today. This is due also to the fact that inflation is triggering this motion towards greater militancy. Well, this is the real problem that austerity is solving, and that economists and experts are so energetically pushing for, is we gotta go back to people to accept our class society as the only possible world without any form of complaint. And this is why we need higher unemployment, and this is exactly the purpose that this sacrifice, which is clearly not collective, of increasing the interest rate is doing.
All right. Now, and I want to go back and circle back to your work, the historical aspect of this, which I think really is explicit. In fact, I'm not even as convinced that inflation in and of itself is the primary driver of the worker discontent in this country, right in this particular era. I think there's a whole host of other things, including COVID just made people realize hey, wait a second, why am I going out there and putting myself on the line to get a disease that has killed now over 1 million people in this country, well over 1 million people, for these wages before even inflation hit? I think there was a growing discontent and a broader discontent. And we should also say, before we go back to the history, up until 10 years ago, there was this law of, we were to accept this as a law of nature, that the lowest amount of unemployment you could have in a functioning economy was 6%. There was it was theoretically, we were told, impossible to have 3% unemployment, because if you did, the entire economy would fall apart. And of course, everybody believed this in the same way that, like, I guess at one point everybody believed the world was flat. And then all of a sudden the ship just goes around and you see it on the horizon. And okay, now we just pretend like that never happened. And I think your argument is that austerity is a similar sort of like fiction that we have all just come to accept is a response to a economic law. But in fact, all of this stuff has been constructed. So let's go back to where you found evidence of this, at its nascent, I guess, at its birth, which was in the World One or the post World War I era.
Yes, definitely. Before I do that, I just wanted to mention, for the sake of completeness, the third element in the austerity trinity, fiscal, monetary austerity, is also industrial austerity, which really points to the fact that you were pointing out, the fact that inflation is just a trigger to this discontent that comes from the fact that industrial austerity in the form of constant privatization, constant attacks on organized labor, labor deregulation. So the fact that now there's precariousness all over the place. These, of course, are elements that increase our dependence on the market, but also boost the miserable conditions we're all in, which is one of the factors I think that people are, as you say, rebelling against in more organized way through strikes, but also in more spontaneous way through these anti-work movement that have really led the Great Resignation as a real phenomenon that has freaked out leading economists. Why is it freaking out? Well, again, because the claim here is that austerity is no mistake. Austerity is structural to capitalism because it is the main protector of capital as the social relation by which we accept our condition as wage workers.